would you characterize the global economic situation today and the prospects for low-income countries?
I want to start with the good news, and it is the world economy today is doing better than we feared even a year ago. Growth is holding, inflation is going down, and the expectation that we will move through this phase of high inflation without recession, the so-called soft landing, is up. That also translates with better conditions for low-income countries. What they see is also their growth prospects improving. They see inflation going down, and some of the low-income countries see prospects of tapping into markets. But this, unfortunately, is not the whole story. Both globally, we are not yet done in the fight against inflation, and major central banks are not rushing to cut interest rates. In low-income countries, the hit of this shock after shock, pandemic, the war in Ukraine, high prices, is felt most profoundly. In fact, our analysis shows that scarring from the shocks in advanced economies and emerging market economies is less than we feared, but scarring in low-income countries is higher than we expected. They today are 10% below, in GDP terms, their projected trend from before the pandemic. So imagine they have 10% less, and then what comes on top of it? One, the fact that they have, many of them have high debt levels. The average debt service eats up 13% of GDP. So you're 10% less, and you spend 13% to service debt. And what I'm particularly worried is that with growth being slow, their chances to catch up are actually worsened. And when we look at low-income countries, we have to recognize they're not one universe with no differences. You have low-income countries with more diversified economies, better fundamentals. They handle all this better. And then you have fragile states. You have countries that are truly facing life or death economic, social difficulties. And this is why it is so important. I want to turn to those who are here and those who are online. Thank you for joining us. It is so important that as we step into the period of the spring meetings, we focus on the low-income countries. And Rachel, thank you for moderating this discussion with Ajay and me.
And certainly an important discussion when we think of how different countries have emerged differently coming out of these multiple hits. So, Ajay, given this backdrop, what are the key challenges that developing countries must overcome to eradicate poverty while ensuring our planet remains livable? And in what areas are innovative solutions most needed to address these interconnected issues?
Yeah, Dan, thank you for having me. And I'm glad to be here for the same reasons that Kristalina just said. By the way, one little point to not forget. The fact that their debt servicing cost is at that level also means it crowds out health and education. In fact, a number of them are spending more on repaying debt than they would be able to spend on healthcare and education. And that just tells you how challenging their own circumstances are. And you can say they should have been smarter when they borrowed the money. That should have, could have is a historical view. The question is we are where we are and people need help. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest issues coming out of what she just said. Your question to me is a little different. Now, since the day I joined, I've been talking about these intertwined challenges. And that's the issue of the fact that to believe that you can take on poverty or sharing prosperity, which were excellent goals for the bank, and much progress was made by many institutions over 30, 40 years, including Kristalina at her time in the bank. that got set back. It started with the pandemic. But I think you've got to realize that underlying this is the fact that climate change, fragility, conflict, violence, food insecurity, and pandemics and healthcare are all things that you cannot compartmentalize and hope that you can deal with them separately from poverty. And so getting that, the consequence of that is that the luxury of compartmentalizing was somebody else's. We can't do that. And so that means you have to take these on and comprehend how to deal with them. And I think that one of the things that a lot of the people in the bank are thinking about is that, do we really need to invent new things we need to do, or do we need to just do them differently? So I would argue that in a number of cases, technology and solutions exist to some of the challenges we're discussing. In others, they don't. To give you an example where they don't and where true innovation is required, or where they are beginning to get available, is, for example, livestock methane from livestock. There is a lot of research going into how to develop the right kind of feed stuff for that to reduce. We help to fund some of that research, so do many others. When you fund that, the question is then what do you do with it? Can you take it to scale and replicate it in as many countries as possible? So we look back 3-4 years from today and say we moved the needle as compared to spreading it out. Similarly, I went to Indonesia and I saw these mangrove plantations where not only had we helped to regenerate the mangroves, but we'd also made sure that the money then went to the community, which was able to then, therefore, not live off cutting mangroves to provide for their lifestyle. It's the same thing in the Amazon today, where, as we know, President Lula has taken out the idea of fighting what was going on there with deforestation. Now, the deforestation was not just plundering. It's because people needed it for their life. But it impacts the rainfall from North America to Patagonia. So we're all in this together. And what he's trying to say is, maybe I can direct that energy into ecotourism, into timber, but done sustainably, into healthcare, into things for the community, so that we can turn from using the forest for one kind of survival to actually creating a different form of growth and development, and not making the false choice of cutting down the forest in return for that. I think there is where the bank can play a role. Take the solutions and technology, invest in new ones, but both those things, scale them and replicate them so we can look back at moving the needle well over the coming years.
That's definitely an important part, the scaling and replicating. Obviously, none of these things exist within a bubble, as you mentioned there. So, Kristalina, what would it take for the low-income countries to reduce vulnerabilities and achieve sustainable and a meaningful raise in income levels, and importantly, quickly?
It will take the countries themselves doing more to build strength of their economies, and the international community to be a reliable partner. The saying goes, it takes two to tango. And here, I want to flag three very important tasks for the countries, and then two for us, for the international community. For the countries, we know, we see it, that those that are doing better are countries with strong institutions, rule of law, transparency, less corruption. And building those strengths is what nobody but the countries themselves can take on. We know, and this is number one, build institutions and policies so you have strength. Number two, countries can very practically look at where they're falling short in generating the kinds of revenues they need to invest in their people, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in prosperity. And we did an analysis that shows that up to 9% tax to GDP is still for grabs in many countries. So build your tax system, especially focusing on bringing more of the economy in the open. You can't do all of it, but as much as you can. the richer part of the population, the businesses that are thriving, they have an obligation to the rest of society. Number three, one thing that we are very concerned in many countries is that their buffers, both domestic and external, have melted during this crisis. So we look at low-income countries, and quite a number of them have reserves, external reserves, below 3 months of import. And this we take to be the critical level for a country to be able to serve its people. So having policies in place and actions to rebuild reserves and look at things that are on the way of that, countries can and must do. And of course, that comes then to our part, because very hand on heart, it would be morally wrong and bad for the countries and the world if they're left to struggle with these challenges on their own. The international community has a huge responsibility to step up. What can we do? Of course, we are source of financing. For the fund, it is this external capacity. We are balance of payment supporter, so we can provide loans, and we have done it remarkably well. I want to thank our board. I see some of our board members, and I want to thank our staff, because the fund in this period of time stepped up remarkably strongly. We have provided about $32 billion in loans. We also provided $34 billion in SDR allocation to these countries. Of this $32 billion, $24 billion is zero interest rate loans. And if you compare to before the pandemic, our level of lending to this group of countries was below $10 billion. So we more than tripled financing, and that is important, but even more important is engagement in collaboration with other institutions and in support of capacity development, institution building in these countries. Because what often people think of the fund association is what? Programs. But actually, very, very frequently, we do much more by helping countries build the tax systems, improve the quality of spending, get institutions to be more transparent. And that, I think, is where that dual role of financier and institution builder, capacity developer, for us stands up. I want to thank the Ajay and the bank. They have also they have moved heaven and earth in this period of time. But we also recognize so much more needs to be done.
And certainly, as you mentioned, a holistic process there, and something that does require work with policy. So, Ajay, bringing you back in here, what specific policies should low-income countries pursue to increase climate resilience, create jobs, reduce poverty, and foster sustainable growth? And what is the role of the international community?
So, I mean, if you pick jobs for a minute, which I think is the single best way to drive a nail in the coffin of poverty, then what you have to think about is the fact that in the coming decade, more than 1 billion people in the global south, by global south, I'm loosely saying the emerging markets and developing economies, there's going to be 1 billion odd people coming of age for jobs. And that's what the demographic dividend is supposed to represent. And I think it will if they grow up with clean air, clean water, health and education, which we started from. But when they do grow up, they need jobs. Currently, the forecast for the same countries is 325 million. That's a big gap. Now, forecasts are not destiny, so we can do something about them. But to do something about them, you need a number of things to fall into place. Policy. So the bank is both a money bank and a knowledge bank. And working with the IMF, who also are both a money institution and a capacity and knowledge institution, We both bring these two things to the table. And the knowledge side of it is where we can help to build policies. She described a few. I could tell you, for example, if you think that gender and the empowering of gender makes a difference to productivity in a country, which kind of with two women on the stage, I'm in a good place saying that, but I believe in it anyway. You have to invest in the policies that make that possible. Everything from access to finance, to education, to quality health care for women, to legislative policies, to the availability of childcare, to the availability of safe transit, and so on. That's just one example. So there's a whole series of these that you can do in policies, trade policies, facilitation policies, that. On jobs, if I can just speak for a minute, I don't know how much time you have, but if I've got a minute, I'm going to use that for this. If you took Africa, where you're from originally,
yes,
where a large part of our effort goes currently, the lion's share of our money tends to go to Africa, particularly from IDA. I believe the jobs that will come in the coming decade will come from 5 areas. Infrastructure and the construction of infrastructure, roads, ports, airports, bridges. Energy, I'm taking it out of infrastructure only because I think connecting people to power deserves its own attention. 600 million people in Africa do not have any power. Changing that is what we think people like us should do. And that'll create jobs. Third will be the whole space of healthcare. Disseminating healthcare to Africa will require primary healthcare centers, nurses, technicians, PPE manufacturing. There's going to be a whole series of jobs there. Tourism, which you can see is already booming. There are recent articles about the growth of hotels and tourism across Africa.
yes.
And finally, agribusiness, because Africa could be the food basket of the world, if done right, with lots of ifs and buts, but it could be there. Then the question arises, are we all, the international community, helping countries on the ground pursue the right policies and the right financing for these 5? And digitization can help, but if people don't have power, they can't charge their phone with their finger. So we have to get them power. It is a basic human right. And so then, are we digitizing, are we helping them with the right policies and the right financing to make that happen? Those are the kind of questions that she and I are trying to tackle as part members of the international community. It's governments as well, it's other NGOs, it's MDBs, it's the whole lot. But that to us is our task.